The dog that once followed you from room to room, the one that waited by the door every single day, can suddenly do something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about it. Daniel never saw it coming. Max had been part of his life for 5 years, a calm, loyal golden brown dog who slept at the foot of his bed, who leaned into his legs when he stood in the kitchen, who watched him with that quiet, steady gaze that made it feel like someone was always on his side. There was a rhythm to their life that never changed. Morning coffee at the same spot on the couch, evening walks down the same block, weekends where Max would rest his head on Daniel's knee as if that was the only place in the world he needed to be. Nothing about Max felt unpredictable. Nothing about him felt dangerous. That's why what happened one ordinary evening didn't make sense, not at first, not even after it was over. Daniel had come home later than usual, dropped his keys on the counter, and reached down the same way he always did, expecting the same response he had seen hundreds of times before. But something in the air was different, something subtle, something easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Max was there, but not the same. His body was still, just a little too still, his eyes not quite meeting Daniel's the way they always had. It lasted only a moment, barely enough for a thought to form, and then it passed, or at least that's what Daniel believed. Because when you trust something completely, you don't question the small changes. You don't stop and ask why. You assume everything is fine because it always has been. And that's exactly how people miss it. That's how something that feels sudden is actually built over time, quietly, invisibly, right in front of you. Daniel didn't think he had done anything wrong. He wasn't angry, he wasn't rough, he wasn't trying to provoke anything. He was just being himself, reaching out the way he always had, expecting Max to respond the way he always did. But in that small space between expectation and reality, something shifted. And what makes this story unsettling isn't what Max did. It's the possibility that nothing about it was random at all. Daniel sat back and allowed himself a moment to observe Max without intervening, noticing the subtle movements in his body, the slight lift of his ears, the way his tail shifted just enough to signal curiosity and caution at the same time, and he realized that understanding Max required more than observation, it required patience, awareness, and a willingness to interpret the language of a creature that could not speak words yet communicated with precision through posture, glance, and small motions. He recalled the afternoons when Max would position himself at the edge of the living room rug, keeping a careful distance while watching Daniel move about, and he had thought nothing of it, assuming the dog was merely resting or waiting for attention, unaware that each position, each tiny shift, was a calculated signal indicating comfort, uncertainty, or preference for space, and that over time, these small behaviors formed a pattern that Daniel had been too busy to notice, until now. As he considered this, he became aware of his own tendencies to rush through interactions, to focus on tasks rather than the subtle emotional cues that Max was offering, and he understood that the disconnect was not a result of Max being unpredictable but rather his own inattentiveness to the silent language his companion had been speaking for years. He watched as Max adjusted his stance, rolling slightly onto his side before settling back with his head resting just above his paws, and Daniel recognized the gesture as a combination of trust and a desire for reassurance, a complex mix of emotions conveyed without a single sound. In that quiet moment, Daniel reflected on the many small acts he had overlooked, the way Max would pause at the door, looking back with a glance that seemed to ask permission or to gauge the environment, the careful sniffing at new objects or changes in their surroundings that conveyed information Max had processed and was willing to share if only Daniel had paid attention, the subtle changes in breathing or tension that indicated anticipation, nervousness, or excitement. With this new understanding, Daniel began to see that Max had been guiding him, teaching him a new way to engage with the world around them, emphasizing awareness, mindfulness, and the interpretation of unspoken messages. The realization brought a mix of humility and determination as he leaned forward, speaking softly, allowing Max to come closer at his own pace, and the dog responded with a small shift forward, ears perking slightly, eyes meeting Daniel's with recognition, signaling the beginning of a renewed connection built on observation, respect, and the careful listening that had been missing until now, marking the start of a deeper understanding between human and dog that would transform their interactions in the days to come. Daniel watched Max slowly move closer, each step measured and deliberate, and he began to notice the subtle ways the dog communicated comfort and caution simultaneously, the tilt of the head, the slight lift of one paw, the calm breathing that spoke of reassurance and the desire for connection, and Daniel realized that every motion, every glance, was a part of a language he had only begun to understand, a language that required patience, observation, and empathy to fully grasp, and in that realization he felt both humbled and attentive, aware that he had missed countless moments that could have deepened their bond long before now. He remembered the walks they had taken together, the careful pacing along the sidewalk where Max would pause to sniff at a fire hydrant or a patch of grass, and how he had previously thought of those pauses as minor distractions when in fact they were opportunities for communication, ways for Max to process the world and convey information that he had never fully noticed. And Daniel recognized that those pauses had been missed lessons in attention, mindfulness, and the interpretation of subtle cues, each one a small but meaningful message about comfort, preference, and awareness. As he reflected, he began to see how his own movements, his tone of voice, and his posture had influenced Max, sometimes unintentionally signaling stress or urgency that Max responded to with caution, and how simple adjustments in his behavior could immediately change the atmosphere, allowing Max to relax, approach, and engage on his own terms, creating a rhythm of trust and mutual understanding that had been absent when Daniel had been unaware. He focused on the soft shifts in Max's body, the slow wag of the tail, the calm position of the ears, and the gentle gaze that met his own, realizing that this was an invitation to reconnect, to be present, and to respect the boundaries and signals that Max had been giving for years, often unnoticed. Every small gesture now seemed significant, from the way Max adjusted his stance on the rug to how he shifted closer when Daniel sat still, and Daniel understood that these actions were deliberate expressions of feelings, each one a choice reflecting trust, curiosity, and the willingness to engage, and that his own awareness, calm presence, and patience could amplify those expressions, deepening the bond between them. In that quiet space, Daniel began to practice attentive observation, allowing Max to lead interactions, and as he did, he noticed a subtle shift in energy, a softening, a willingness in Max to approach more openly, and Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility and care, recognizing that understanding was not immediate but built through careful attention, respect for signals, and the patient acknowledgement of the silent language that had always been present, waiting for him to truly listen and respond. Daniel leaned back slightly, allowing the room to settle into quiet, and he reflected on how many times he had misread Max's signals, how his own assumptions had created blind spots in understanding the dog's intentions, and he realized that every behavior that had seemed sudden or confusing was part of a pattern that he had overlooked. Max shifted his weight subtly, ears flicking, eyes tracking Daniel's movements with measured attention, and in that careful observation, Daniel began to identify the cues that had been present long before the evening had unfolded differently than expected. He remembered moments when Max would move away from a hand that reached too quickly, or retreat slightly when a gesture seemed abrupt, and how he had taken these small actions for granted, missing the chance to understand the dog's perspective, to recognize the nuance behind each movement, and to respond with awareness rather than automatic reaction. Daniel thought about the times when he had unintentionally rushed through greetings or tasks, assuming that Max's calm demeanor meant contentment, when in reality the dog had been communicating boundaries, comfort levels, and emotional states that required patience and attention to interpret correctly. He considered the mornings when Max would pause at the door, or the way he positioned himself near the kitchen, not as obstacles or distractions, but as messages about personal space, curiosity, and vigilance. Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility to notice the small things, to treat Max's behaviors as meaningful communication rather than inconsequential actions, and he began to internalize the idea that trust and understanding were built not in dramatic gestures but in consistent observation and careful response. The room remained quiet except for the gentle shifting of Max on the rug, and Daniel found himself attuned to every movement, the rise and fall of the chest, the soft inhale and exhale, the attentive gaze that followed him with a mix of expectation and reassurance. He realized that responding thoughtfully to these signals could restore a balance that had been subtly disrupted, that his presence could become a stabilizing force rather than a source of uncertainty, and that the relationship he valued so deeply was strengthened through awareness, consistency, and respect for the unspoken dialogue that had always existed between them. In that moment, Daniel committed to observing without assumption, to giving attention where it was needed, and to understanding that Max's quiet actions carried meaning, and that learning to interpret and respond appropriately was a responsibility and a privilege that would define the connection they shared in the days and weeks to come. As Daniel continued to watch Max with undivided attention, he began to notice patterns that he had previously overlooked, subtle adjustments in posture and gaze that communicated more than words ever could, and he realized that these small behaviors were consistent indicators of comfort, hesitation, and intention, signaling how Max processed his environment and interactions. The afternoon light filtered through the living room windows, casting a warm glow over the hardwood floors and highlighting the faint rise and fall of Max's chest as he breathed, and Daniel observed the careful positioning of his paws, the gentle tilt of his head, and the slight twitch of his ears, all of which conveyed a nuanced message about his state of mind and readiness to engage. He recalled the past week, the moments when he had reached for the leash a few seconds too early or stepped into the room without noticing the way Max was already positioned, and he understood now that those seemingly minor actions had been interpreted by Max as signals that required evaluation, signals that influenced how the dog approached each situation and decided when it was safe to proceed or when it was necessary to pause and assess. Daniel felt a mixture of humility and enlightenment as he recognized the importance of these interactions, and he began to internalize the principle that attentiveness and patience were crucial for maintaining trust and mutual understanding, realizing that the bond they shared was reinforced not through grand gestures but through consistent observation and careful responses to the subtle cues that Max provided. As he settled further into the couch, he allowed his movements to become slower and more deliberate, consciously making space for Max to move and make decisions without pressure, and he noticed the immediate effect this had on the dog, who responded with a slight relaxation, a soft shift of weight, and a gentle nudge toward Daniel's hand that spoke of reassurance and acknowledgement. Daniel reflected on the countless mornings they had spent together, the walks along familiar streets, the quiet moments in the kitchen, and the way Max had always anticipated his routines, providing constant, gentle reminders of his presence and expectations, and he recognized that understanding these patterns was key to interpreting Max's behaviors accurately. With a renewed sense of purpose, Daniel focused on the small signals once more, the flick of an ear, the subtle wag of a tail, the attentive stare, and he began to see that Max's actions were deliberate communications, offering information about his comfort, preferences, and needs, and that by respecting and responding to these communications, he could rebuild and strengthen the trust that underpinned their relationship. In that moment, Daniel felt a profound awareness of the depth of Max's intelligence, the intentionality behind every gesture, and the responsibility he carried to observe, interpret, and engage thoughtfully, understanding that each interaction shaped the ongoing connection between them and created opportunities for growth, respect, and mutual understanding that extended beyond what words could convey. Daniel noticed the subtle changes in Max's behavior over the next few minutes, the way his eyes would follow every movement with keen interest, the careful shifts in his posture that indicated both comfort and attentiveness, and he understood that these small, deliberate actions were Max's way of communicating readiness and trust without words. He reflected on the moments when he had previously misinterpreted similar cues, the times when he had moved too quickly or spoken too abruptly, assuming that Max's calm demeanor meant he was content, and he realized now that each of those instances had been opportunities to observe and respond more thoughtfully, to deepen the connection that had always existed beneath the surface. Daniel's own breathing slowed as he matched the rhythm of Max's movements, noticing the slight wag of the tail, the gentle positioning of the paws, and the way the dog would occasionally glance up with a soft expression that conveyed reassurance and expectation simultaneously. It became clear to Daniel that understanding Max required not only patience but a conscious effort to interpret the nuances of body language, to see beyond the immediate actions and recognize the emotional and cognitive intentions behind them. He recalled the small routines they shared, the precise timing of meals, walks, and quiet moments on the couch, and he began to understand that these routines were embedded with meaning for Max, providing structure, predictability, and an ongoing dialogue of trust and communication that he had been only partially aware of until now. Every slight movement, from the lift of a paw to the tilt of the head, carried significance, and Daniel felt a renewed sense of responsibility to observe and respond in ways that honored the intelligence and emotional depth of Max. As he watched, he also became aware of his own patterns, the ways in which his habits, tone of voice, and body language influenced the dog's responses, shaping Max's comfort and willingness to engage. This awareness brought a profound realization that their interactions were part of an ongoing, dynamic exchange, where attentiveness, empathy, and respect created a foundation for understanding and trust. Daniel began to experiment gently, adjusting his movements and observing the changes in Max's responses, noting the increase in relaxed gestures, the softening gaze, and the subtle cues that indicated willingness to approach and engage. In that quiet, shared space, Daniel felt a deep appreciation for the complexity of Max's communication, recognizing that trust and understanding were cultivated over time through observation, careful interpretation, and responsive interaction, and he committed to continuing this attentive practice, knowing that each moment offered an opportunity to strengthen the bond, to honor Max's perspective, and to create a relationship defined by patience, respect, and mutual awareness that extended far beyond the routines of daily life. Daniel felt a quiet shift in the energy between himself and Max as he continued to sit patiently, allowing the dog to make choices about proximity and interaction, and he became increasingly aware of how much trust and communication had been silently cultivated over the years. Max's eyes followed him with a calm attentiveness that spoke volumes about their bond, a bond built on countless small, consistent gestures that Daniel had only begun to notice and interpret correctly. Each subtle movement of the head, each slight repositioning of the paws, every slow blink conveyed a message that Daniel had previously overlooked, and he realized that understanding these signals required not only observation but a willingness to interpret them within the context of the dog's perspective, recognizing the intelligence, sensitivity, and emotional awareness that Max brought to every interaction. He reflected on the previous moments of tension, how misinterpretations and missed cues had contributed to misunderstandings, and he understood that these experiences were valuable lessons in empathy and careful attention, guiding him to adjust his own behavior in ways that reinforced security, clarity, and positive communication. As he leaned slightly forward, speaking in a soft, measured tone, he watched as Max responded by moving closer, tail wagging slowly, ears tilting toward him in a gesture that communicated both curiosity and reassurance, signaling that the dog was comfortable with the pace and direction of the interaction. Daniel noticed the nuances of Max's breathing, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and how the positioning of his body shifted subtly to indicate openness and readiness for engagement, and he recognized that these were invitations to strengthen their connection through presence, patience, and careful observation. He thought about the routines they shared, the patterns of daily life, the familiar paths and quiet moments, and how these had always provided a framework for communication that Daniel had sometimes taken for granted. Now, he saw that each routine was imbued with meaning, an ongoing conversation in which trust, reassurance, and awareness were continuously exchanged and reinforced. Daniel began to practice a heightened sensitivity to the small gestures, observing without anticipation or judgment, responding with calm, deliberate movements, and allowing Max to lead interactions according to his comfort and preferences. In doing so, he felt a growing sense of clarity and confidence, realizing that their bond was not defined by dramatic events but by the accumulation of attentive, thoughtful engagement. Each interaction, each shared moment of quiet understanding, strengthened the relationship and built a foundation of trust and mutual respect that would guide them through the subtle challenges and joys of their daily lives. Daniel understood that by maintaining this awareness, he could ensure that Max felt safe, valued, and understood, and that the lessons learned in these small moments would shape a deeper, more meaningful connection that extended beyond routine, beyond habit, and into a shared experience of empathy and companionship. Daniel sat back in the quiet of the living room, feeling a deep sense of reflection as he considered the journey of understanding he and Max had been on over the past hours, recognizing that every moment of attention, every small gesture, and every subtle cue had contributed to a more profound connection that extended far beyond simple companionship. He thought about the mornings when Max would rise early, waiting patiently as Daniel prepared for the day, the soft shifts in posture that communicated both anticipation and reassurance, and he understood that these routines were a continuous dialogue, offering insight into trust, comfort, and the unspoken needs of a loyal companion who had always been attentive to his presence. The events of the past days, from small misunderstandings to moments of keen observation, had illuminated a pattern of communication that Daniel had not fully appreciated before, a language of posture, gaze, and behavior that spoke volumes about Max's emotional state, preferences, and willingness to engage, and he realized that learning to interpret these messages required patience, focus, and an openness to observe without assumption or expectation. As he observed Max stretch and adjust, settling comfortably near his side, Daniel noted the subtle cues of contentment and ease, the soft relaxation of muscles, the gentle movement of the tail, and the focused yet calm gaze, each element forming a coherent message about security, trust, and the desire for shared attention that had been quietly offered all along. He reflected on his own behavior, recognizing how his routines, gestures, and tone had previously influenced Max's responses, and he understood that the responsibility of maintaining and deepening their bond rested on consistent attentiveness, careful interpretation, and responsive engagement that honored the intelligence and sensitivity of the dog. Every interaction, from the simplest glance to the smallest shift in proximity, carried meaning and provided an opportunity to reinforce trust, demonstrate awareness, and foster a sense of mutual respect that strengthened their relationship over time. Daniel felt a growing sense of commitment to continue practicing this attentive observation, allowing Max to guide interactions, respecting his comfort and preferences, and creating space for trust to flourish through deliberate, thoughtful presence. He recognized that the lessons learned in these moments would extend into every shared experience, forming a foundation of understanding and empathy that would guide future interactions, enrich the emotional bond, and deepen the connection between human and dog. In that quiet space, Daniel appreciated the subtle complexities of canine communication.